Welcome back to more sampling with Kontakt. We'll continue where we left off in the last video. Let's close down the mapping editor and open up the group editor. You can go ahead and delete the empty group called group 1. First, let's turn the red Edit All Groups button off. When you're working on groups, make sure you keep an eye on it. If it's on, any change you make to a group will be applied to all groups, which can make your life easier, but also mess up instruments completely. Once you've turned it off, go ahead and change the panning of the two microphone groups. Dry L, all the way to the left, and dry R, all the way to the right. You can also increase their volume. The signal is a lot quieter than dry pre-signal, so we can afford to turn it up a little. This is the sound of the piano without amplification, and is in stereo, rather than the mono preamp signal we've been working with so far. Using the button up the top here, you can select groups via the drop-down menu, which is useful when you're working with a lot of them. Then we have a standard editing drop-down menu, which you can also access by right-clicking in the group window. You can solo one or more groups. If you just want to hear the microphone groups, select both of them and click the group solo button. You can also select groups via MIDI, meaning that if you play a note, Kontakt will select a group that contains samples that were triggered by the note. We're not going to work with voice groups in this series. They can be very useful, but not for our purposes. If you want to find out what you can do with them, have a look at the manual. Group start options allow you to decide when a group should be triggered. Let's set up some conditions so that the preamp group is triggered when the sustain pedal is off, and the microphone groups are triggered when it's on. Select the preamp group and set the first condition to start on controller. The MIDI continuous controller or CC message for sustain is number 64. So go ahead and enter it into this field. You can leave the minimum on 0 and change the maximum to 10. Now select both microphone groups and also set them to start on controller. Set the CC number to 64 and enter 11 for the minimum and leave the maximum at 127. Now when you press the sustain pedal, which I'm doing right now, you should only hear the microphone groups. Kontakt also by default plays back the entire sample when you push the sustain pedal, so you'll hear the microphone signal sustain too. When the sustain pedal is off, you should only hear the preamp group. Obviously, it doesn't make much sense to do this in the context of this instrument, but you can probably imagine scenarios where this is useful. For instance, triggering sustained samples of a piano. It's not limited to that though. You could build an instrument that contains samples of several instruments and switch between them using CC messages, which could be useful in a performance. For now, let's set all groups back to always trigger. Activate Edit All Groups, select one of them, and reset the condition. You can set Kontakt to several sampling modes. Usually, leaving it at sampler or DFD, which stands for direct from disk, is fine. But feel free to play around with the different modes. They can be a fun effect. As of Kontakt 6, there's also a wavetable synth available. Tracking tells Kontakt whether samples should be pitched up or down if they're spread over several keys. You can use a release trigger to only start a group of samples when they receive a MIDI note off message, meaning that they only sound when you let go of the key. This is often used for pianos, because a real piano's hammer mechanism would fall back down when you release the key, making a small sound. You can also reverse samples and set the quality for the transposition of samples that are mapped across several keys. You can insert a number of different effects on individual groups in these windows here. Click on the little plus and you'll see the available effects. Filters, EQs, compressors and limiters, amp simulations, stomp boxes, modulation, and utilities. You can change the number of post-amp effects here, meaning that the effects will be added after the amplifier module. On the left here, they would be added before. Notice that reverbs aren't available here. Reverb can only be added at the instrument level, which we'll cover in the next video. This next bit is quite important. When you insert effects at group insert level, here, this entire section, the effect will be applied to each voice, i.e. note played separately. This means that certain effects like distortion will sound completely different here than if you insert them as a bus effect. Let's add a distortion effect here. You can leave it at the default settings, but bypass it for now. Next, open up the output and set it to bus 1. Scroll down and open up the instrument buses. Make sure that you're on bus 1 here, and then add the same distortion effect. Now listen to what happens when I have the effect enabled here, compared to what happens when I have it enabled here. Hear the difference? So keep this in mind when working with effects and try different places to put them. It can make a big difference. I'm going to delete this distortion up here and this one here, and instead add something a little more subtle. Some saturation, turned up to maybe 50%. The last thing we'll look at now is a feature of Kontakt I'm a huge fan of, and that's ripe for creative abuse. It's called the AEt Filter, which stands for Authentic Expression Technology. You can think of it like an Instagram filter for sound. When you apply a filter to a photo, you're not actually changing the photo, just what the colors and contrast look like. The AEt filter does something similar. It takes the spectral information of one sound and imprints it onto another. The process is a little complicated, but bear with me. First, open up the Samples Workshop folder and go to the Electromagnetic Field Recordings folder. Have a brief listen through some of the samples. Pretty harsh, right? Let's go back to Kontakt and create an empty group. Double click on it and name it EMF. Now open the mapping editor and select the Selected Groups Only button. Select a few of these and drop them into Kontakt. Next, we want to make sure that their velocity ranges don't overlap. Select all of them and spread them along the entire key range. Now go back into the group editor and turn the volume of the EMF samples all the way down. Make sure you've got all the samples selected. Right click on them and select Create AET Morph Layer. You can select the entire range and we'll name it EMF. Now repeat the process for the preamp group. Select all the samples, click Create AET Morph Layer, and we'll call this one preamp. We can now close the mapping editor. Making sure that you've still got the preamp group selected, go to its group insert effects and add an AET filter module from the utilities section. Click on Edit Morph Map and type in preamp to EMF, then click Add. Now select the preamp layer on the right and click the arrow to add it. Repeat the process for the EMF layer. Now select Articulation Morph and click OK. For the last step, select our morph map that we've just created. Have a play around. Pretty wild, right? Notice that different velocities will trigger different sounding effects. I picked a pretty obvious example to show you what this thing can do, but you can go much more subtle with it if you want. Try out different samples with the same process we just did, and see whether you can make some cool sounding patches. That's it for now. Make sure you save your work. We'll continue with it in the next video. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.